Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to go over the books I've read this week, and it's been quite a fun one. It's been an interesting mix, and you'll see a bit of prize sort of stuff leaking in there, but otherwise just quite an interesting and fun set. Not to say that the prize ones weren't interesting, you know what I mean. But here are the 5 books that I've read this week, and let's get started. So first up, we've got 2 books by the same author, by Liam Konemann, and I'll start with his novel. The Arena of the Unwell is published by Cypher Press, the sort of small indie queer press who I love, and this book I think I've spoken about briefly before, just in terms of gearing up to read it, and this is essentially about a young man who is sort of in and around the sort of indie music scene. He's got his favourite band who he loves, and he's sort of caught in this slightly strange love triangle. And all of that sort of sounds sort of fairly standard, but then add into that quite a lot around trauma and mental health issues and various other things. And it's quite an intense book. It's interesting because, so I read this as part of a book club that I'm in, and I found it quite bizarre because I think all of us around the table kind of felt like we'd been falsely advertised this book in some ways, based just on some of the quotes on the cover, where it talks about how this book kind of talks about the NHS, and actually that's a really very small part of this book, and it also talks about it being a sweaty, sticky mosh pit of a novel, which in many ways it is, but also so much more of this book really feels like it's about the sort of love triangle between these characters. And so what sort of it looks like this sort of really dark, gritty book, in many ways feels a bit like a fairly standard. Sounds like I'm sort of insulting it here. I think it's interesting because it's quite a standard sort of story format in terms of a love triangle. Our young sort of protagonist Noah is sort of caught between this sort of couple who are not quite a couple, and sort of, you know, the sort of relationships between the 3 of them. And so what kind of ends up happening is this sort of quite, and again, predictable sounds like I'm being quite insulting towards it. I kind of did see what was kind of coming in this book a mile off, and I didn't necessarily not enjoy it for that reason. I still enjoyed it. I still found it incredibly readable. But I think the thing that maybe I found quite strange is that I think I was expecting something quite different based on just sort of how the book had been sold to me by quotes. So still enjoyed it overall, but I think it's quite an interesting one. And it's a difficult read in terms of going into quite a lot around, for example, self-harm, mentions of sort of suicide and various other things. So it's not an easy read. It just reads very quickly, if that makes sense. Some kind of exploding car outside my house. Great. And I hope they're okay. I think it was just an exhaust. But anyway, and so this book sort of does then sort of feel like this quite bizarre sort of darker version of that kind of love triangle than we normally see, perhaps. And there's a lot in there. So didn't fully love it, but there's a lot to like about this book, I think, nonetheless, and it's still a very interesting, good read. But I think overall what I enjoyed more was Liam Konemann's other book, which is a really short little non-fiction book called The Appendix, or Transmasculine Joy in a Transphobic Culture. And so this looks at Liam Konemann's experiences as a trans man, and particularly a trans man who identifies as gay. And also within that, he basically charts newspaper headlines he sees and kind of comes across in his life that have sort of quite transphobic angles to them. And the way he does this is quite interesting because he purposely doesn't go out of his way to find them. He's not sort of scrolling through Twitter looking for all of these things. Instead, he sort of just finds them as they come and notes them down and sort of talks about it. And sort of as a result brings in his own personal experiences of being a trans man, but also just offers a sort of a wider critique of society and sort of how things are shaped and how some of these things happen and are allowed, you know, how we allow so many newspapers to have really quite horrendous headlines and sort of bylines and all those sorts of other things, when there are people whose lives are materially harmed by such things. So really, really interesting and kind of fun to read these 2 sort of side by side to kind of get a sense of Liam Konemann and sort of who he is and his sort of outlook on life. Next, as part of another book club, I read The Sun Isn't Out Long Enough, which is a selection of poems edited by Tatevik Sargsyan. And this I thought was really quite interesting. It has a few poets in here who I already know and really like Peter Scalpello, John McCulloch. Mary Jean Chan writes a sort of an introduction to this. So quite a few people who I already sort of know of and really enjoy, but a lot of poets who I'd never heard of before, and sort of also had some really interesting things to say. So I found it a really interesting collection, sort of pulling together so many different strands and so many different poems and ideas around so many aspects of the queer experience, particularly bringing in a lot. I mean, this was sort of early into sort of lockdown, the sort of initial ideas of it started, so that sort of permeates it, the sort of sense of isolation crops up a lot in this collection. But I found it really interesting, and I think it's also quite fun just to read a few poets who I've never come across before, because the Peter Scalpello and John McCulloch poems I knew I was going to enjoy, but everything else was sort of like, ooh, what is this new and exciting thing? So yeah, really fun to check this out, and I'm excited to talk about it with the book club and see how they find it. It's been quite a fun mix. I think so far, the three books we've done together in this book club have all been like 5-star reads of mine, which is not saying much because I'm quite a generous reviewer, but I've loved them quite a lot. And this is one where I'm like, oh, this is interesting, but you know, thematically it's always harder to like a whole collection of poems because by different poets, because some of their styles might just not work for you. So I'm intrigued to see how it all goes, and I'll keep you updated. But yeah, fun nonetheless, and exciting to kind of see this sort of little poem collection sort of really bring together some beautiful voices. Next up, because I can't avoid a book prize at any point apparently ever in my life, I read Appliance by J.O. Morgan, and this is shortlisted for the Orwell Prize, which the shortlist of which I love. I'm going to do a separate video once I finish the last two from it, but it's a book prize all about political fiction, and well, there is a non-fiction bit as well, but the fiction side is sort of any fiction that sort of has a political bent to it, and that can be quite varied, right? What counts as political and what doesn't. But this explores the idea of what it means to sort of have technological innovation, and so there's essentially a machine that teleports things. And the way it teleports things, as we find out quite quickly in the book, is not necessarily to actually send that item there, but to essentially create a copy of it and then almost 3D print it on the other side. But what then comes up is a wider discussion about what makes something a real thing and not just a copy. Because if someone's passing through, or an object is passing through this transporter thing, is it actually the same thing? Almost like the Theseus's ship paradox, or whatever it is. The idea that almost these people have been rebuilt from new parts. Are they actually the same thing? If we sent through the Mona Lisa and it's been reconstructed, does that mean it's actually still the Mona Lisa, or is it some kind of copy? So it kind of explores quite a lot of this, and there's a sort of a personal sort of family element to this as well, about somebody who's potentially going to be doing this. And it brings up this idea of this fallacy around technological advancement, because at one point they talk about creating sort of mines on the moon to kind of harvest materials that are needed, and then somebody asks, well, what are these materials used for? Once we get them, what are they used for? And people say, well, actually that's to fuel the machines that then transport people to the moon. So it's like, well, that's circular and kind of pointless then. We're basically just destroying the moon's resources to create something that gets people to the moon to get those resources to power this thing. And it's all sort of so circular. And so it plays around a lot with that idea in quite a fun way, and particularly what happens to people when they move through this. And there are a few experiments about sort of transporting like a tiny bit of someone's organ to see if it maintains the same, but actually people often pass through and seem to end up sort of soulless in some way. And so it sort of suggests that there's nothing that can really be copied about the human experience or the human body. These are sort of, yeah, so it's a really interesting book. Not maybe my favourite from the shortlist overall, only partly because the shortlist is full of books that I've adored, but I thought was still really interesting and quite a fun, like, this feels like a really good thought experiment as a book, in a really good way, I think. And last but not least, this is a book I remember seeing in a bookshop a while ago and just being like, ooh, this actually sounds quite fun. And this is The Social Lives of Animals. So this is a non-fiction book where Ashley Ward takes us through various animals in the animal kingdom and how they cooperate to survive. So for example, we have how rats might work together as teams to sort of observe each other so that they don't die of poisoning or of some sort of inaccurate, a sort of horrible food source. We have how, for example, pack animals will work together and sort of do that for, not only for hunting but also to build community. The ones you might expect are in here as well, like elephants, but you also have some quite unexpected ones in here, like sort of flies and sort of various insects, and how they work together to sort of create this this sort of way of surviving. And it's quite an instructive thing then to think about how humans then interact, because we watch how various species of monkey work together, and in some ways a lot of that mirrors quite a bit how we work as humans. So really interesting. And this is just a really fun read when my brain was a bit fried, to just sort of sit and read about how elephants are quite nice. I feel like I'm underselling this book. It's really well researched and really well thought out, but it's actually written with quite a fun sense of humour. Like, it's a book that understands that it's talking about something that potentially could be seen as quite scientific or quite academic, and makes it quite fun. So I really enjoyed this. And that takes me to the end of the 5 books that I've read this month. And, a few of them are a bit shorter, but yeah, fun. I've just put that in the wrong way. Fun nonetheless to read these 5 books, and to sort of, this has been what I've needed. Work has been horrendously busy and everything, and these have been the sort of the way through, and now things will be a little bit lighter, so I will be back to reading way too much. Anyway, I've been Bob. I hope you've had a good week and a good reading week, and take care. I'll speak to you all soon. Bye bye.